Hello there, welcome to Mike's Mets Podcast, your host Mike Pashota. So I'm going to be unveiling a multi-part series, which I am going to be calling the Mets Top 10 Offseason Acquisitions from the year 2000 to present day. So this is going to be several different parts, just because the list was 10 players, which I go over each one, as well as 3 honorable mentions. So I wanted to include all the information for those players as much as possible, and really detail out what I was going to be looking for when I made up that list. So I'll be looking for the releases of the additional parts of this list. For this episode, I'm just going to be going over the honorable mentions, and we will pick it up with number 10 starting next week. So keep an eye out for that continuing list. And it's probably going to be the release schedule until this opening day. So we're looking forward to opening day coming up pretty soon. And as a reminder, my plan is going to be that I released a episode to coincide with each game or every other game that's being released in that comes out in the 2023 season. So for every game that's played, I plan on releasing an episode to go along with it the following day. So that is going to be my release schedule for that as well. So hope everyone enjoys that and enjoys this upcoming list. Before we go any further, I just want to say if you want to support this channel, please follow us on Spotify or Anchor. The podcast name is Mike's Mets Podcast on both channels. You can also follow us on YouTube, the channel name being once again Mike's Mets Podcast. If you were so inclined, please comment, like, and subscribe on that YouTube channel. And finally, please follow me on Twitter at Mike's Mets Pod, all one word. And if you were so inclined as well to like any of the posts I might be putting up on Twitter, I'd greatly appreciate it. So let's get started. So there's a few things I want to talk about right off the bat, and that is basically how I came up with these rankings for the top 10 Met offseason acquisitions of the 21st century. So since 2000. And I want to make sure these criteria are put in. So it is not just the caliber of player that the Mets signed, but also how well they actually performed while they were part of the New York Mets during their entire tenure. That includes injury history, time that they spent, not just on the DL, but if there were any kind of suspensions or anything else that played a part. Bad play, anything like that was all taken into account for their entire time period playing with the Mets. And I went through an enormous amount of offseason acquisitions. This took me a long time to go through. I was just basically sifting through every offseason acquisition that was made. And I briefly thought about just doing the entire Met offseason acquisition for the entire franchise history. But truthfully, the Mets offseason acquisitions are not the most high profile. It's really more their midseason acquisitions that really played more into the franchise's entire role. And there's huge midseason acquisitions that were made. Keith Hernandez and Mike Piazza come to mind, but they're not going to appear on this list because those occurred mid-season. This is purely for the off-season, from the months of October to March, and in some cases April. That was the time period I was looking at. Anything postseason and preseason was included for this list. I have also included some honorable mentions in this case. My first honorable mention I want to talk about is going to be Pedro Martinez, with Mets had signed back in 2004, in December 16th to be specific. And his time with the Mets was interesting. First, it should be noted that Pedro Martinez was an enormous acquisition when they picked him up. Pedro was, at that point in his life, still considered one of the very best pitchers in baseball, even though his career had clearly, seen better days, but he was still playing at an incredible, pitching at an incredible rate, particularly with the Red Sox, where just 2 seasons prior he had won I believe it was his 5th ERA title, but in 2004 he had a tricky year. That was the year, as everyone remembers, with the Red Sox that they won the championship. Pedro didn't really play a big part in that, and during the regular season, he actually was really struggling. He saw his ERA skyrocket up to 3.9. He was still striking out guys at a competitive rate, but everything around across the board, well, it looked very ugly. It was the worst year of his career at that point. Even counting in some of his early days with Montreal, he pitched, I think, far better in those years, and he just really was not looking like the pitcher that he used to be. But the Mets took a flyer on him. It was, and I say take a flyer. He was, still considered the prime of his career, even if you factor in, some of the Mets' more recent free agent acquisitions, who were definitely in their more advanced years. This is not really. This was not that much of a difficult decision at the point. He was turning 32 or 33 at the time, and the Mets were betting on the fact that he was going to be moving to the National League. He seemed very much still to be the Pedro of old, and it looked like a good move. And it was a good move for that first year in 2005. He absolutely delivered 15-8 during that year, a 2.82 ERA. He pitched 217 innings that season, the same amount that he had pitched in 2004, but saw his strikeout rate dip a little bit, but he still pitched incredibly good during that period of time. Was not really involved in the Cy Young voting that year, which was a little surprising because Pedro had a great year that year. He led the league in WHIP. And also led the league in strikeouts per walk. So he was definitely humming along at the same clip that he had always been doing. And truthfully, it was one of the best years of his career. He finished with a 7 WAR that put him in among the league leaders that season. And it was a great year. It was basically the last good year of his career, unfortunately, because after that point, bad things happened to Pedro. He did not really factor into the Mets 2006 season. Although he pitched far more than I really remember that season, he was gone really by the mid-year, and was not going to be able to pitch at that point. Various amount of injuries took him out of the running. He was actually an all-star that season, although I forgot. I think he was not even actually factoring into that team. They might have replaced him as an injury risk, but. As an injury reserve, but that season was not good. In very limited time, only 23 starts. He went 9-8, 4.48 ERA that year. Really struggled, and from that point on, you don't see much of Pedro in a Met uniform, and that's why I'm only factoring him in as an honorable mention in this case. He only really pitched 1 year in total for the Mets. After that point, it's just a series of missed opportunities. He would missed almost all of the 2007 season as well. He was not really factoring into that season either. And then 2008 was terrible, and he was so bad that the Mets were not interested in bringing him back. He would ultimately sign with the Philadelphia Phillies for his last season in 2009, and actually pitched pretty well. In an abbreviated season, he only made 9 starts that year, but went 5-1 with a 3.63 ERA. Unfortunately, this was with the Phillies, so we're not going to really factor that in either. So over the 4 years during his Met tenure, ultimately the numbers are fine. They're not great. I'm factoring him in as an honorable mention mainly because he's Pedro Martinez, a future Hall of Famer. And he had a memorable first year, but that was really it. Ultimately, for his career with the Mets, he was 32-23 with a 3.88 ERA. Numbers that don't really jump off the bat. He had a 3.69 FIP, and really was just fine. He was fine in total. Really one great year, but that was it. And so ultimately, Pedro will not factor into the listing in this case. So we're going to go right past Pedro and move on to the next honorable mention, which would be Carlos Delgado. And Carlos Delgado was actually traded to the Mets. The Mets picked him up in a trade from the Florida Marlins. They had traded a certain number of prospects, in this case, most notably Mike Jacobs and Yusmeiro Petit, and someone else named Grant Somas, who I'm not familiar with, but Mike Jacobs, we as Met fans saw plenty of times when he was playing with the Marlins, and ultimately he was not really a big part of those Marlins teams because he was pretty quickly out of the league from that point on. But the Mets picked up Carlos Delgado in this trade, and this was a huge acquisition, as I recall. Delgado, it's an interesting career with Delgado. He's somehow never really been considered a top flight player, even though he was widely considered one of the best offensive players of his generation. And was an MVP candidate with during his time in Toronto, and then when he came to New York, he was coming off an impressive career at this point, and was threatening on 400 career home runs at the time he had been signed. Had plenty of success with not just the Blue Jays, but in his 1 year with the Marlins, had hit pretty well, hitting 301 with 33 home runs and 115 RBIs that season in '05 with the Marlins. So the Mets were acquiring a preeminent slugger, one of the better sluggers of in baseball at that time. And he does kind of a Pedro here, where his first season was pretty good. Ultimately, his numbers are not as great as I thought they were. His counting stats are excellent. He hits 38 home runs and 114 RBIs during the '06 season, and is a fantastic backup in the lineup, batting fourth. Primarily behind Carlos Beltran. More on Carlos later on. But he factored in perfectly in that lineup in '06, sandwiched between Carlos Beltran and David Wright that year. And with that 3-4-5 group, the Mets were rolling. Those three guys really just hit home runs, drove in guys all year long. And it was a great year for Delgado. He saw his batting average slip quite a bit down to 265, and that kind of ultimately factored into his value with the team, because Delgado was not a good first baseman. He was actually considered one of the worst first basemen in the league for the most part, and they tried generally when he was in the American League to play him at DH whenever they could, just because he was that bad. He was not very maneuverable. In terms of his performance in the field, he had far worse seasons, just from a metric standpoint, but he was not playing very well during that time in the defense. So that first year with New York, even though he has great counting stats, he only factors into a 2.7 WAR, and a big part of that is, you have to take away his very poor defensive skills, the fact that he couldn't really run at that point in his career. So you didn't really see a lot in terms of his true value, but he could homer with the best of them, and that's something that does need to be taken into account of. And he did fill his role very well during that season in 2006. After that, it gets a little tricky, because in 2007 he has a spectacularly terrible year that I'll still remember as probably being the biggest sinker of the Mets that year. Some bad things happened in '07, but Carlos Delgado's performance was so bad, I cannot even describe it. Like the stats don't really do it justice. I mean, they're bad, but he really just falls off the plate. Like, Father Time hit Delgado like a ton of bricks. He only hits 24 home runs, drives in 87 batters, bats 258, which is, I don't even know how he did it, because I remember stretches during that season where he was just not hitting for so long, and it was really killing the Mets to the point that I was like, it became a running joke that they were going to have to start taking him out of the lineup, and especially in that final stretch of the season, he was absolutely killing them. So '07, not good. Again, 24 home runs, 87 RBIs. He only finishes with 781 OPS. That was an enormous drop off from the previous year in '06. I think I forgot to mention he had a .909 OPS there in that year. So this is a drop off of about 120 points. This is not nothing. This was a enormous drop off where I can't really I really cannot describe how bad he was. He kind of comes back the next year, and the counting stats are roughly the same as they were in '06. As they are in 2008. He has 38 home runs. He drives in 115 batters. Bats 271, 871 OPS. So great. He's hitting a little bit better. And it does factor in because he was an important part of that team. There was a lot of other problems with that '08 team that kind of fell apart during the year, but his WAR during these two seasons in '07, '08, not good. He finishes with 0.2 WAR in 2007, so he was an almost replacement level player in 2007. 2008 brings it a little bit back, but only a 1.3 WAR. I mean, it's insane. Like how like from that standpoint, he was just apparently useless in this case. So it's really astounding to think because I didn't really realize it at the time. I was just happy he was hitting home runs and driving in batters, but he really wasn't doing much else for the team. And these are things that did play a part in sort of the Mets' struggles. The fact that he could only really do one thing, which was just be an effective power hitter. And he had some memorable moments. I remember during that season, he hits the 2 home runs, drives in 8 batters during that game against the Yankees. It was a Subway Series game, and sets the Mets single game franchise record. It was 8 or 9 RBIs. I had to check that, but it was a incredible performance that one game. And that was basically what you saw from Delgado that year. He really refocused himself in terms of hitting home runs and driving batters. He has a much better year, but he doesn't really factor into doing that much else. And then 09 is a lost season, and that's ultimately his last year in the major leagues. He's hitting well during the brief time that he's there, and you got to think that the Mets were really missing him in 09 because the Mets had no power hitting at all. In the limited time that he was there, only 26 games, he still hit 4 home runs and drove in 23 batters and was actually hitting at a pretty nice rate. He was batting 298. Again, in 09, the Mets were really bad offensively, like really, really bad, like Carlos Delgado 07 bad. So the Mets would have loved any kind of offensive help at that point, and he just was not there. A lot of injury problems, and kind of ultimately causes him to lose the remainder of his career. He's done at 38, I believe. He retires at that age. Even younger, actually. His last game, he was only 36 years old, so he retires relatively young for a guy who had such a prolific career and was a career that really deserves more credit that he's really gotten. But unfortunately, he was kind of a one-trick pony. He finished his career with a 44.4 WAR, 473 home runs, 280 batting average. I'm not going to go too deep into his career because he's not going to be enshrined in the Hall of Fame as a Met if he ever gets enshrined in the Hall of Fame. But I would love some love for for Carlos Delgado at some point because the guy did basically everything right and just didn't really get the recognition. He's kind of just lost in that era of the steroid users and all that stuff. So unfortunately, Delgado doesn't really get his just desserts most of the time, but I would like people to kind of put reference on Carlos Delgado more. In this case, he's only going to be an honorable mention because he plays decently for 2 seasons. And again, the counting stats are really impressive, but it's really the 07 season that kills him in my mind. It is just an absolute dumpster fire of a season, and it keeps him from being on this list. With some other people who I think you'll see were more deserving than Delgado to be on this list. All right, so let's move on to our next honorable mention. And this was just 5 days after the Mets had traded for Carlos Delgado. They go ahead and sign free agent closer Billy Wagner, who had previously that year had been on the Philadelphia Phillies. And Billy has a pretty good run with the Mets during this point. He is acquired and is basically the frontline closer that the Mets really desperately needed for years, and just could not find him forever. Finally, they get him just in time for the '06 season, and he has 3 really good years with the Mets. There's nothing to say. There's an outlier where he didn't play particularly well. It wasn't a year where he got hurt. He pitches really well for 3 seasons with the Mets, or actually 3.5 seasons for the Mets technically, because he would be part of the Mets 2009 team ultimately his last season, but was cut pretty early on, and he doesn't really play a part during that '09 season. Another guy who doesn't really factor into that '09 team, who they probably would have loved to have. But I'll focus mostly on his '06 to '08 run with the Mets, which is the Mets' most successful run during that decade. He's very effective. If you look through his stats here, like he has 101 saves during his time with the Mets. which is, not nothing. I mean, like, very impressive. 101 saves and not too many blown occasions. I'm looking through here. He blew 5 in '06, 5 in 2007, and well, seven blown saves in 2008. So not that great, but it doesn't really factor in too much into him. And he's really very successful during the Mets. He's not dominant to the level that he was during his time with Houston or even Philadelphia, but he has a really good run with them during this '06 to '08 period. Even finishes sixth in Cy Young voting in '06, and we can think back to '06. The reason why was mostly because there was very bad pitching in 2006. It was pretty bad. So a guy who was a closer, plays a little bit more of a part into the Cy Young voting than he normally would, because the season is good. It's not like, whoa, that was one of the best seasons I've ever seen. He finishes that first year with the Mets in '06 with a 2.24 ERA. He saves 40 games, like I mentioned before, 94 Ks in 72 innings. Really, really good performance there. And he just has, this is just basically a typical Billy Wagner year. He actually finishes with his best strikeout rate per 9 innings that he'd had since his incredible 1999 season with the Houston Astros. In that season, he had struck out 124 batters in 74 innings. This was like Edwin Diaz level of performance. Aroldis Chapman, Craig Kimbrell. He was just blowing guys away in '99, and he basically keeps up that same run for the next few years, including with the Mets. He was just a very solid closer. There's really nothing you can say. This is why he's a Hall of Fame candidate, is that he just did everything really well, and he was a spectacular performer, a teammate that can really only be said as a so teammate, but he was really successful during his time with the Mets. Again, his 2006 season, very good. 2007, he was one of the Mets players who was actually performing at a pretty solid clip for them. Only stayed 34 games, but that was mostly because the Mets were just blowing games left and right for him with problems in the bullpen and the starting rotation. So that really didn't play that much into his problems. He did everything that he was supposed to be doing. 2.63 ERA. It's not 80 strikeouts and 68 in the third innings. He's seeing his strikeout rate decrease slightly, but his 2008 season, definitely not as good as his '06 or '08 season. In terms of his WAR value, he's seeing his value decrease more and more from 2.2 in '06 down to 1.7 in 2007, and then ultimately a 1.0 in 2008. So he's performing great. He makes 2 All-Star teams in '07 and '08, but his value is starting to decrease more and more. And I had thought about including Billy Wagner as one of the top 10 acquisitions that the Mets made. Ultimately, I felt there were guys who had more lasting value than Billy. It's tough because closers don't really get a lot of WAR, unfortunately, but Billy Wagner was a excellent closer, and the Mets had a string of terrible closers, going back to Armando Benitez, and then guys like Braden Looper. It was bad. Like, they had really bad closers for a long time. Billy Wagner was a dream in comparison, and even his faulting periods of time, he still pitched really well for the Mets. So much love for Billy Wagner. I do hope he makes the Hall of Fame eventually, although it'll be as an Astro if he does if he does ever make the Hall of Fame. So we won't spend too much time on his career, but really a great career, and a guy who strangely doesn't get as much recognition as he probably should, but definitely one of the most dominant closers during his run in the major leagues.